Welcome to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you know, the Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, developing some innovative technology for wildfire mitigation. I have got with us here the amazing Jonathan Reimer, who is joining us from the country to our north that can't keep its smoke to itself, up in the British Columbia area. Jonathan, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you, Steve. Very well, and happy to be here.
So how's your fire season going so far?
Well, it's post-fire season now, and so it's the season for after-action reviews and for unwinding. But we're finding, just like you guys are, that our seasons are starting to blend together.
It was a trick question, Jonathan, right?
Oh, darn it.
There's no fire season anymore. It's fire
That's
year,
true.
right?
Gosh, you get partial
Uh,
marks.
yeah, right.
Yeah,
So you're having a little bit of downtime where you can do some post-peak season review.
that's
And
right.
what are you finding?
Well, as you probably know, 2023 was a huge fire year for Canada. We generously shared some of our smoke
Yeah,
with you.
it was your largest export, right?
Yeah, and import. We imported you folks for quite a lot of you, and people from everywhere. And actually, this year as well, in 2024, we had more than 500. I think almost 600 people were imported from the States, from all over. We
That's
tend
like
to go.
one per 100,000 miles or something like
Yeah,
that.
I know. That is, I think, the big difference is when you talk to the folks, especially from the States, who come up and they say, what did you learn and what was it like? We have a lot of land, we have a lot of fire, and we don't have the numbers of resources that sometimes they're used to.
Yeah, right. And so what do you do when you have all these fires and all this land and very few people to go battle it?
Yeah, it does change the whole way you approach it. So you're less likely to try and stand in a circle around it and hold hands, and
Right?
go direct in every area. It makes you prioritize and say, what are the areas that we really care about? What are the fires that we really care about? What are the values we're trying to defend? And then what's achievable with the resources we have? And so I spend a lot of my time actually with Parks Canada, and we work up north a lot, and that is it's like Canada squared in the sense that much more land, much less resources, and we spend a lot of time with heli torches and with ping pong balls,
Oh yeah. Dragon
up
eggs, right?
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So using fire, steering in fires into old fires, finding places where we can use natural features, and actually even like finding places where we can achieve positive landscape level goals.
Okay. So tell me about when you talk about prioritizing, the assets. There's probably no one in the room who stands up and say, "Oh, you can let my town burn.
Yeah, totally.
We
Uh,
much prefer this other town."
Maybe this is as well a little bit of the advantage of Canada, and especially the north of Canada, is that there's not a lot of towns and there's not a lot of roads. Many of the roads, especially up north, are ice roads, so they freeze over in the winter. You drive on them in the winter, but in the summer, you actually have to fly into these communities, or the calculus just changes a lot. That's not our experience in most of British Columbia, but if you talk about the far north, so you always prioritize a community, but you might not necessarily prioritize somebody's trapping cabin, or we have a radio infrastructure all over, and you're going to have to say, hey, this weather station, it might be an acceptable loss because we care about maybe this cultural value, this First Nation cultural value more, and those are the types of decisions that you end up having to make.
So those are decisions, though, that I would imagine you have to make in advance because that's a lot of kumbaya to manage during an actual active fire.
uh, have to is maybe strong. Prefer to, I
Prefer
think, is,
to?
yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
if what we normally, and most of our fire organizations are on top of this, where they're trying to make as many of these decisions ahead of time as possible.
Yeah.
But as you know, it's very difficult to plan for every type of fire that you might get, and you often have more than one fire going on at the same time, and so you have different complexes of values that are threatened, and you're making at least some of these decisions on the fly, and that's part of my main interest now. Is I'm actually have stepped away from. I'm rarely in the helicopter, circling these values, saying A, not B. I'm actually an emergency manager now, and I step behind the multiple incidents and the multiple incident commanders and say, hey, what do you need? How are you valuing and evaluating these two different threats? And how can I help you make really great decisions?
Okay. And to speak to your issue of what do you need, is that really a demand-driven thing? The guys on the ground say, and the girls, this is what we need some aerial tankers and some resources and dozers and this, or are you saying, here's what we're sending you because you can probably use it?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
First we do need like the folks on the ground know what's going on.
Yeah.
They see what they need, or they have a plan. They're right there, connected to the resources, and so we tend to defer to them. That's almost all what we do. When we talk about risk management a lot in fire, but generally what happens is folks on the ground, you have your incident management team, your incident commander, and they say, I need a bunch of bulldozers and I need 5 helicopters. And we say, we have 4 helicopters, so we'll send you those. And then we do that until we run out of resources, right? And then we call that risk management.
Okay.
But there is something where we can start prompting incident commanders or folks who are on the ground who often have their world is that fire.
Yes.
And then you have your regional wildfire coordination officers or provincial or state or national, and they're looking at things a little bit more holistically. And I think it's increasingly our job to ask them leading questions about, why are we trying to go direct on this fire? What's the actual value? Or why are we prioritizing this over that? Is that because this is something that you have pre-identified, or is this something that maybe a different incident commander in the same decision or decision space would actually make a different decision? How can we lead folks into a larger view and to make better decisions?
So do you do like incident management teams, or is there an incident commander?
Well,
because you talked about how a different person might make a different decision, so presumably you get more people in the room and they reach consensus. Is that how that works?
Well, I mean, I think you're probably pretty familiar with this in the sense that you start off with an incident commander and you get an ops chief, and then you build out, and eventually you get your type 2 teams or your type 1 teams. You guys in the States have actually done a great thing where now you've collapsed that dichotomy. But I think what's really interesting is, so you've done this, a lot of our data comes from the States. You guys have so many resources to study things. And one of the amazing findings that I find people don't actually talk about as often as they should maybe, is that when you put different incident command teams on the same fire or similar fires, you can see what they do, what resources do they ask for, what sorts of tactics do they use. And it turns out they do very different things. And they ask for really different amounts of resources, and so that's shocking. So what does that mean to us? Which ones are high performing, which ones are low performing, which ones probably should be asking for more resources, which ones are, they could probably do with a bit less, and how do you actually get from where we are now to that ideal state where we never expect every incident command team or incident commander to do the exact same thing. That would be unachievable and not really desirable. You want some diversity.
How do you know who's doing best practices unless you have somebody else's practices to compare it to?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is something as well that I think maybe the biggest thing we don't talk about is, so you go out there and you make a decision, you do a burn operation, you choose to let it burn, you do whatever. What would have happened if you had made the other decision, or the other third decision that you were thinking about? It's really hard to walk away from something and say, oh, we did a great job, that was a success, or yeah, we really kind of we made the wrong decision, but we got away with it. We didn't actually have a bad outcome. And that's I think maybe our biggest challenge in fire these days.
So there's like an equivalent to what was that movie? I'll come back to it.
Okay.
Wonderful Life, right? Where they show you what the possibilities would have been, if you'd have done different things, right?
And how great would that be, right? To be able to replay a fire, make 3 different decisions, have them play out, and then actually compare them afterwards. That would be,
the ghost of fires past, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which means that we got to be a little bit creative, right? So when we evaluate, well, I guess maybe let's back up. Why do we even want to evaluate? Like, why do we care if we feel good at the end of a fire or at the end of a fire season even? And the trick with that is that if we don't have really clear feedback, this is where the behavioral science can step in and help us. And in places where we have really clear feedback, like say, if you're a chess master, you win the game, you lose the game, it's pretty clear feedback. Those folks get dramatically better with practice, and you can measure how well that they do over time. Folks where you don't have as clear feedback, you tend not to learn very robustly over time. And so you can think you're doing a great job. We see this with stock pickers. They're picking stocks, they're really confident, but you can track whether they're improving over time or how well elite teams do versus other teams. And there's basically no difference because they don't learn over time because there's not really good feedback. There's not really clear. They're not set up for success.
Okay. Well, you talked about chess players, and they get the feedback and become hopefully better chess players. And then of course you have chess players like that play against computers, and eventually the computers beat them. Garry Kasparov learned because there's a feedback cycle where the computer can not only look at outcomes but can predict multiple future moves ahead. To what degree is that what you aspire to be able to look ahead many moves and then make the moves right now to have the right outcome at the end of the game?
No, you've hit on something I think really important is that we're seeing an information explosion in fire, and I think even some of the work you do is part of that situational awareness building, giving people new tools. We're seeing predictive services. Almost every national government, provincial, state level has some sort of level of predictive services. You're using models. You have models of models. They're getting increasingly powerful. We're in Canada. We're launching a satellite. You guys have a bunch of satellites already, and so that remote sensing piece is getting up. So we're just seeing incredible amounts of information that we never have had access to. And what I'm interested in is how can we combine all this information with judgment, with people. I think we all agree we still need the people. We can't just let Deep Blue run our fires. Not yet.
Right.
Anyways, we're a long way from that. Maybe we'll never get there. But how can we combine the expert judgment?
Could help though, right? It could say, "Here's what I suggest. Now you take it from here."
Yeah.
Someone has to take the blame at the end.
Blame it on the computer if you can, for sure.
Right.
And people do that all the time, right? So if you're on the fire line, you're in an incident management team, you're making a decision. Are we gonna, let this flank go or prioritize A or B or C? What you generally have is you have all this fire behavior modeling. You have all this different weather forecasts. You can even say, hey, what if we do this kind of ignition? You can model out what these various options give you. And what we haven't asked it maybe as much is that we've thrown information into that space. And what we've just assumed that more information is good. You're going to get better decisions. And that's what we're seeing. And it's really interesting. They've done, this is back from like 2006, where they gave incident commanders different levels of information. And those that received the most amount of information performed the least well, but thought they were doing the best.
Right. Yeah. The Dunning effect. Huh?
Well, yeah. Is it that? Maybe it is. It's just what they said in the end was that you're spending all this time evaluating all this information, right?
Right.
But there's a few things that actually matter, and often you have those pretty early in the fire. And so spending your time evaluating this excess information doesn't add much value, and it actually takes away from your concentration on the few factors that actually matter. So I'm actually more interested about where can we take information out of the decision process? Where can we simplify this? My experience has been, as an incident commander myself, is that there's not many times you're saying, we talk about uncertainty, and that's basically lack of information. But I'm not usually sitting there being like, I don't really have a lot to think about. I don't have a lot of information in front of me. I'm spending a lot of time saying I have a lot of information, but I don't know what matters here. Is it the wind? Is it the topography? Is it the fact, that it's going to take a long time for people to get out of here when I need to give an evacuation alert or order? What is the critical pieces of information, and how do I weigh them against each other?
Yeah. So how do you do that?
It's a
I mean, how do you,
question.
when you're paring down the information input, which inputs have you found really don't contribute a lot to the outcome?
Yeah. I think what's great about fire is that it resists a systematic explanation where I can say, oh, what matters is wind,
Right. Yeah.
or
Well, the wind
it's,
does. Wind never doesn't matter, right?
yeah, it's exactly.
Yeah.
Everything matters sometimes.
Okay.
And I think that's why I love fire. It takes a specific type of person to thrive in a fire event, right? Because you're making decisions that matter to your
Right.
own safety, to the safety of your community.
Sure.
You're making them with with real time constraints, right? You often don't have a lot of time. They're highly complex and they're dynamic. So as soon as you think you get a handle on what that fire is doing, it does something else.
Yeah.
Um, and
And you
you're
find like that's the fun. Like if you could get
exactly.
a handle on this, then any lower echelon person could do this. It's the fact that it's an ever-changing game, that makes it exciting for you.
Yeah. And if you look at the type of people who like that environment, who thrive in that environment, that's a specific subset of individuals, right? Who are like, I
Sure.
want to be in that helicopter. I want to be, sitting on the hood of a truck, making that call. Yes, we're going to push the button on a big ignition operation. Um, and those, I mean, I'm probably one of those people myself, but those people don't tend to always be the same type of people who are really good at teasing out systematic decision support for
Right.
saying, over the last 25 times I made this type of decision, 75% of the time, I saw that this factor was the one that really mattered, and I made the wrong decision 20% of those times, and so I need to, increase the amount of weight that I give XYZ.
Okay. Very interesting, right? And so you have people who have that bias towards action, I think they call that, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And then people towards bias towards analysis.
yeah,
And then people
exactly.
who have a bias towards nothing because they have analysis paralysis, right?
Yeah, yeah. You're right. And I think that is actually our tension. So we talk a lot about, like, we have our operations people and we have a research community, and there's all of these attempts to meld them, to have them talk to each other and inform each other. But they live in different worlds. They have different personality types. They have different tools. They use different language. And I think you've put your finger on that key piece, is that we have this bias towards action. These folks who have these really practical, operational, in the moment skill sets and also problem sets, and then we have these folks who are looking pretty big picture, and they have fancy charts, and how do we get them to talk to each other and actually, it seems like in the end what we want is these folks who are ops people to feel supported, to make better decisions, and to actually, as much as we can quantify it, to actually make better decisions. And I think the answer there is actually not generally throwing more charts at them and more
Right.
behavior models, and it's actually to look at, okay, what is it like to be in that space? What information do you have? What information matters in that space? What information might they need? And how can we make the things that matter really salient? Like, how can we, you know,
Mm.
something I've heard you talk about, and we all talk about now, is this, you can call it the recruitment or retention crisis that we're facing, is that we're seeing more people making more complex decisions with less experience, because we are seeing more people retire. We're having
Yeah.
people with less years of experience out there, and decisions are getting harder. How can we
That's a
set them
great
up for
recipe, isn't it?
success? Yeah.
Harder decisions being made by less experienced decision makers.
Exactly. And so this model
Yeah.
that we've had of intuition, where hey,
Yeah.
how you learn to make that decision about whether to push the button on ignition ops, or which fire you can let burn, or which fire to prioritize, is that you do it, 100, 1,000 times over your
Yeah.
career, and you develop this, expert intuition, this, lived
This gut.
knowledge,
Yeah.
this gut. Exactly. So if you talk to fire guys, they love their gut. They trust their gut. They have to some extent, but they're also inclined to, like, just by temperament. I don't think that's a coincidence that overlap is there.
Right. And sometimes with fatal outcome.
Exactly, right. And
Yeah.
increasingly we're putting folks into novel situations where, you might not have ever seen a situation like that because these situations are really rare.
Yeah.
I was on the Fort McMurray fire in Canada in
Oh, wow.
2016.
That was the
And
big fire, right?
the big, for Canada, that was our most destructive wildfire in terms of,
For
homes
most
destroyed.
countries, right?
Yeah, yeah, hugely expensive, right? Tons of
Yeah.
resources. I think we had like more than 2,000, 3,000 resources there. For Canada, that's a huge amount
When you
of
say
firefighters.
2,000 resources, are you talking individuals, pieces of equipment,
All of that
teams,
combined.
all?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
What's the metric for the 2,000? 2,000 watts?
Mostly firefighters, right?
Firefighters. Okay.
We tend to have more people, but we also have pieces of heavy equipment, and we
Right. The
have,
dozers, and
yeah,
they had
exactly.
make a lot of complex decisions in that fire, right? We're going to
Yeah,
bulldoze these homes because we need that space for fire break, right?
incredibly complex decision. And it's one that is rarely talked about now, which is a real shame because we're making more of these decisions over time. We had Jasper this year. We saw these decisions being made in places like Waterton or other places that were like really impacted by fire. Is that we want to be talking and really cognizant about these high, when you even when Fort McMurray happened, we had a little bit of lead time where we could have made some of those decisions, but we didn't.
We
And
decided instead drop the kids off at school and pick up the dry cleaning.
it's exactly right. So
Yeah.
yeah, you might have read like what
Mega
fire
fire.
weather or whatever it's
Yeah.
called. There's a
Yeah.
bunch of, and I was actually the Wildland Urban Interface branch director of that fire. I showed up after I think I was 7 something days after the big main event. So I came in
Right.
and relieved those folks who like barely slept. And it was something I had never seen. And at least I could recognize that, hey, I need to have a really open mind here because the skills that I have developed over my career,
Right.
some of them are going to apply here and be relevant, and some of them are not. I'm going to have to learn new things about how to fight this fire and what tactics to use.
When you get a fire of that magnitude and the anticipated speed with which it's going to come through an area, do you ever just look at the clock and look at the live feed of the video and just say, they're going to take me, by the time I get there in 7 hours, it's going to be all over. I'm just going to show up for mop up.
Am I 7 hours away or am I sitting there already?
Yeah, no, if you're 7 hours away.
Oh, if I'm 7 hours away, yeah.
Yeah, like many of the resources aren't pre-positioned there, right?
Yeah. It is
You've got to
true.
send resources with these distances. We're going to get there in time to roast the marshmallows.
Yeah. It depends. Like usually a community will have some sort of resources. But I think you're actually hitting on something really interesting is that more and more we're seeing a disaster coming and we're having some amount of time, not nearly enough amount of time that we would
Right.
like. We don't usually get like, 2 or 3 weeks.
Never enough time. Right.
Yeah. But we might have a day. We might have 7 hours.
Okay.
We might even have, Waterton is a community that had, I think 3 or 4 days. I'd have to go back and look, where they said, "Hey, this fire might come. We're going to push the button on evacuation order now,
Okay.
and we're going to use these 3 or 4 days to do everything we can, just in case this fire does make a huge run at us." They didn't know whether they would or
Rarely
not.
proactive, but awesome.
Yeah, and it was the biggest operation of that kind I've ever seen, where we had huge high volume sprinklers and structure protection set up. We had, we brought on basically every local fire department what we could get a handle on, and we did as much as we could at the time, and then we kind of thought we got away with it. We kind of thought that fire was never going to come. And then actually, as the sun was setting, so it was becoming dark, the fire started moving. It was about 20 kilometers away, surged over a ridge, had this crazy cold front, this crazy wind event that was coming through, and it got to the community in 3 hours, maybe 2 or 3 hours.
Wow.
Moved about 5 kilometers an hour overnight, which is not what we expected.
Right.
But we were ready, and all of that paid off. We actually never lost a structure at all in the community. There was no injuries. All of the people were out. It was kind of the anti Fort McMurray in that sense, that we took the opportunity to make the decisions that I think you're alluding to there.
So interesting. So you said they had 3 or 4 days notice. Is this because there was an existing fire that they thought might be moving towards them, or or was there also like, predictive software saying, hey, everything's ripe for things to go south?
It was a fire, and they
Okay.
used fire behavior modeling
Yeah.
to see what's possible. I mean, every fire organization, every incident management team is leaning pretty heavily on fire prediction modeling, fire behavior modeling now. But the fire was like 30 kilometers away. When it started,
Yeah.
35 kilometers away. It was actually in the next
Not that
province
far,
over.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's
Um,
depends on what the fuels are, and those
right.
fuels it didn't feel very far given the way that fire had potential to move. But it sat there. It sat there. It kind of skunked around and extended its perimeter along this big ridge. It's actually the ridge is the same ridge that I think is the border between Idaho and Montana. If you follow that up, it's the border between
Okay.
BC and Alberta, and so it's sitting on this what they call the Great Divide. And we didn't know if it was going to cross or not. And if it did cross, we didn't know how long we had.
I
And so
see.
they said, hey, let's just be on the cautious side.
Yeah.
My God, if we had not done that, the community would have been lost. I think at
Sure.
least big parts of it. And would we have been able to get people out safely in the middle of the night in that amount of time? I'm not sure we would have.
Probably not. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, how are you taking what you learned from that and trying to replicate that where there's other high fire probability likelihoods?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
It's a great
how can we
question.
do that in all the other cities where a fire's on the way? Do you have the
Yeah.
resources or
Yeah.
some way to prioritize getting out ahead of the fires?
The one thing that you could do is just say, oh well, every time a fire is threatening a community, just evacuate the community and set up structure protection, right? That's not the answer,
Yeah.
actually.
Right.
What we
Uh,
is first off, we could never do that. Imagine evacuating a community every time you had a fire on its doorstep. We would have most communities in the Western U.S. evacuate on the big fire season,
okay.
or
But how
like
often have you personally been evacuated?
I have never been evacuated.
Okay, there. So your practice level at evacuation is zero, right?
For as an individual, yeah, you're
Right. And
100%.
so this is probably the case for most communities. They've never done an evacuation. So
Yeah,
the idea that they might have to do some evacuations that didn't turn out to be necessary
yeah,
would make them more practiced evacuators.
yeah,
And then, it's just like we do fire drills in school. Like,
yeah,
okay, the bell rings, we line up, no talking, go to gather at point C, call your parents and say it's just a drill, whatever it is, right? We know what to do. But communities, because maybe the expense or the difficulty or the unpalatableness of it, they
hmm
don't practice evacuations. Maybe
yeah,
you do in the emergency management office, or
yeah.
they model it out on a computer what the evacuation would look like. But unless you've done it, you really don't know what you're doing.
Well, you're right on there. Where evacuations, we often imagine that okay, as an incident commander, I'm going to identify some hazard. I'm in the all hazards world now. I'm not just
Right.
fire. So it
Yeah.
could be that a flood's coming, an earthquake's coming. You guys do it for hurricanes down south, and you're gonna or maybe a tsunami. Or maybe you have a little bit of time even, and you're gonna push the button, and then people are going to receive your alert, and they're going to say, oh, I'm going to do everything that it says in the FEMA handbook or whatever. I'm gonna,
Right.
get my stuff. I'm gonna get my grab and go bag. I'm gonna report to the reception center. I'm going to notify my friends and family where I am. I'm gonna register as an evacuee. That is not what people do at all, and it's far more complex. Takes a lot more time, and people, as an incident management team, you might go to, 3, 4, 5 different evacuated communities in a season. Uh, for that individual evacuated community, very unlikely. Sometimes you might get evacuated twice in a 10-year period, but
Okay.
most communities are getting evacuated once in 100 years or less. And so they don't have the learned experience that you're talking about. And so we're going to have to, I think, first off, get better at communicating and maybe exercising with maybe not the entire community, but you can find slivers of community that will play with you, on your evacuation tabletop
Drills.
exercise or
Yeah.
drill. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
I could see that really being a life-saving thing for communities to do. Once
exactly.
every 5 years, we practice a mass evacuation.
Yeah. I was part of Fort McMurray, where we had our largest evacuation that ever happened in Canada, and I wasn't at the scene yet. If you've ever looked at pictures from that evacuation, it looks very much like paradise over in California, where people are backed up on the road, traffic
Yep.
is ridiculous, and you
Right.
have rank 5 plus fires on the roadway, spotting
Yep.
across. You can't see anything. You're in an ember shower. A horrible situation. There's videos of people on motorcycles just trying to shield behind cars.
Yeah.
Not what you want to
Terrible.
see. No one died in that evacuation, and that is incredible. You know,
Wow.
if you run that evacuation 100 times, that happens maybe a couple times.
Yeah.
But then on the other side, last year, or maybe now, yeah, last year, I guess, 2023, we evacuated Yellowknife up in Northwest Territories for a fire that again was 30, 50 kilometers away, and it looks like it might take a huge run towards them. And that was about 20,000 people or so. And they were out of town. The whole community was gone for about a month. That fire never came. And so what's interesting is the amount of disruption to that community. Imagine if you shut down a town, or for them, that's the capital city of the Northwest Territories. It's one of the biggest cities in the North anywhere. And the community, the economy, the impacts to folks are huge, incredible things. So when you push the button on the evacuation, you have these two harms that you're trying to weigh off against each other, right? The certain harm of if I displace this community for who knows how long,
Right.
the social, economic, cultural harms that you're doing are immense, versus the harms of what you might do on a Fort McMurray, where now you're too late, and now people might die on the way out, or they might never get out. And you're weighing these two off, and how do you make that decision well? That's what I'm really interested in.
How do you do it? What's the answer?
Well, what you don't do maybe is you rely on your intuition, because you probably don't have an expert uh, assessment intuition. You haven't done this 100 times. You failed 20 of the times, and now you've learned this over time that this is what you do. What you hopefully have is some sort of process that can support you in weighing these two things off. Because
Okay.
what I have found is that quite often you have the people making these decisions could be the local fire chief, but it might be the local police chief. It might be the incident commander, and it might not be a wildfire. So you have different types of agencies that are actually the incident commander there. And these folks all think in different ways. They have different life experience. They have different perceptions of how much threat is needed before people should be moving out of there. And so what we need is some sort of framework, some sort of decision support system that can give them some guidance. They're ultimately going to have to sit down there and make that call. They're going to have to push the button, yes or no.
Right.
But if we can give them some tools to do that, and I think, for example, California has done that for most of its communities, where they have done some pre-planning, and they've established, for wildfire at least, where are the thresholds, where are those trigger points for saying, hey, this type of fire in this area is going to trigger this type of evacuation, or at least you should be considering it.
Right. And you hope that you can't really pre-plan your evacuation route because you don't know which roads are on fire until it happens.
Exactly. And this
Yeah.
is really the trick, is that you're going to have to make some of this up at the whole point. Nobody would let you make the type of decisions that an incident management team is making if there wasn't a fire that was threatening lives and property in that
Right.
area, right?
Tsunami is much easier, right? The ocean's here, the evacuation route's there.
Yeah,
Like the
exactly.
fire, you don't know which way it's coming from. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting.
And so you're
Tell
going to
me.
have to make some decisions on the fly, but our goal is that let's shrink that down to what are the decisions that you have to figure out at the time, and what are the decisions that you can actually, like, what can we chip away at
Oh,
beforehand. Yeah, so
okay.
you're shrinking that space, because if you've ever been part of this as an incident commander, you have 3 radios on the go, everybody's yelling at you, the press is trying to get a hold of you. It's a very dynamic environment. How do we shrink that space where you need to be really on your game and say, hey, this is your priority number 1. This is your priority number 2. And this is some guidance for how to address it. Not so much guidance that you're going to get lost in charts again,
Right.
but some practical tools that actually can make your decisions better in a really difficult circumstance.
And so you're saying that would be by paring down and then linearly progressing your decision process. Like, what do I need to decide right now, and what decisions can wait? And the
Yeah.
more decisions can wait, great. The more you can focus on what you're doing right now.
Yeah.
And by the time you get around to that other decision, you'll have more information to help the process.
Yeah. Yeah. Or what can you delegate, and then what can you delegate
Yeah.
at different
Delegate
levels?
it
But
all.
yeah,
You're the
exactly.
boss, right? I mean.
And so I think you're on exactly what I'm thinking, to the sense that, so you have all these decisions being made to make, and choosing what decision is the most important, the most critical is I think that's where you have to start. And then once you zoom into that decision, there's usually, here's the 3 to 5 things that tend to matter in this decision. Focus on getting those pieces. If you don't have those pieces, you need to get those pieces. But then don't get distracted about, here's 10 things that might matter, or 10 things that are available to you. Oftentimes we focus on information we have instead of information we don't have, because it's much easier to
Right.
do that.
Right.
But oftentimes the pieces of information that matter are the things that you don't have, and the things that you do have might actually not matter very much. And so you probably should actually ignore those. And so how
Okay.
can we give folks that kind of guidance?
Great question, right? So,
Yeah.
all right. So when you were doing, incident management, and maybe even currently in emergency management, and you've got your 3 radios, and people are yelling at you and putting pieces of paper in front of you for you to sign, and asking you, whether you want the meat, the chicken, or the fish, or the vegan meal, and all that stuff that you're processing. Like, what are some strategies that you personally have developed to be able to maintain some focus, to be able to get a good deep breath, and to
Mhm.
keep your state of mind such that you can make good decisions rather than just being caught in the frazzle of it all?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the first part is exactly what you're getting into there, is that you need to be present in the decision. You need to be well rested enough. You need to be psychologically there, mentally capable of being in a space that's really difficult. And we
Well,
have, of
you
course,
can't
go
you
ahead.
can't choose to be well rested once it starts, right? You either were or you weren't.
Yes and no. So I'll push back
Okay.
slightly on that, in the sense
Yeah.
that it is an emergency for that community, an unexpected emergency that they have a fire where they are. It's
Right.
not an emergency for an incident management team that they're on a fire that's threatening a community.
Yeah.
That's your
Right.
job,
Right. Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so if you are not well rested as an incident commander on your 4th deployment, that's an issue that is your problem, your failure, because you should have known, or maybe the agencies should have known, that you have this many incident management teams, that you have this, you're going to incidents, and that you need to sleep sometimes, you need travel time. You need to set up systems that allow folks to not feel like they're in an emergency. So, first responders need to not feel like this is a once in a lifetime emergency. This is their job, and they need to not, we need to not burn our folks out, right? We
Yeah.
need to
Right.
give them rest, give them space, and to the extent that we can, give them problems that they're able to solve and resources to solve them with.
Well, when you say give them rest or give them opportunities, is it sometimes a matter that you actually have to require these things? Because when adrenaline kicks in and the fire's going, or you have patients on on the ambulance and stuff, like, you don't want to leave, right? You feel like not only are you not serving the people who you're there to serve, but you also feel like you're missing out.
Yeah.
And so people will tend to overstay on scene when they should be getting rest, and maybe have to be sent home.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Is it telling a first responder to rest, and to to think of the big picture, or that, hey, don't put yourself at risk for this objective. Our first responsibility, this is in every emergency management organization you go to, in the UN or in the States and Canada, our first responsibility is always to the health and safety of our first responders. And the reason why is that if we burn ourselves out, if we injure ourselves, if we kill ourselves out there, God forbid, we are not any help to anybody. But telling a first responder to prioritize themselves, very difficult. That's not the type of person who tends to be
Right.
attracted to these sorts of things.
Right.
So
I'm just gonna
you,
take a nap, play some Candy Crush, tune
yeah,
out for a little bit.
100%, right?
Yeah, that's
Um,
hard.
and so you have to set up systems, structures, sometimes policies. Sometimes you have to say, hey, you are going to get in trouble. We are going to, I don't know, uh, maybe we're going to discipline you in some ways if
Right.
you put yourself and your team at risk, and,
Yeah.
and at risk that we consider unacceptable. Because, for example, if you're in a team, it's one thing to put yourself at risk. I don't encourage that type of behavior. But if you're putting your team at risk or your operations at risk, that is not a professional organization. It's not
Right.
sustainable. It's a big deal. We have killed firefighters in Canada, not as many as you killed in the States, but we don't have as many firefighters. And it's just, a very serious situation. This
Yeah.
is not a sustainable approach to firefighting. We need to take our own health and sustainability seriously. And so that's where I'm getting at, where I'm saying, yeah, we need to be in a place where we can actually make good decisions sustainably, not just on this fire, but on every fire that we get to. And that's
When
the
you
place to start.
yes, and you talked about post-season analysis or Monday morning quarterbacking, and so you're looking at that in terms of the big picture, right? What were the challenges that we faced this year, and how did we manage them? But then you also talked about fallen firefighters
Mhm.
and the specific circumstances around them. And in Canada, the ones I remember most were trees falling on you and crashing the vehicle that you're responding in. Those seem to be some of the
Yeah,
bigger
maybe.
ones.
Yeah, yeah. You're right. Trees and vehicles, aviation. Sometimes we've been pretty lucky so far, but those are the big ones, 100%. And those are numbers games. In this, you can say, oh, at any particular situation, you can say, oh, there was a burning snag, right? And that snag was fire weakened. The team should have identified that hazard, created a no work zone, and not gone in there. Um, but the truth is that if you expose enough firefighters to enough burning snags over
Yeah,
enough incidents, you
right.
can guarantee that there's going to be so many near misses, and then after so many near misses, that there's going to be a death, perhaps worse,
Yeah,
multiple deaths or something. And so, the way that you reduce that is first putting on in good policies, obviously, but also by reducing the exposure game. So every time we expose a firefighter to a burning snag or a difficult situation or fly people up in a helicopter, we need to make sure that there's an objective for that. And at the extent that we can, we're minimizing that exposure over time.
so the
And
objective isn't I think I get to be in the helicopter.
totally. And that's what we used to do, obviously, right?
Right. Yeah.
People love being in helicopters. So we used to send people up for recce's, used to invite, local politicians up or different stakeholders, and we'd get them up in a helicopter and we fly them around, and people loved it. But that's not something that you see on the ground much anymore, for the
Right.
reason that we're talking about, is that every time you lift off and set down and fly around, every
Yep.
hour that you're in the up
Yep.
there doing a recce after a lightning storm comes through looking for smokes, that's an hour that there's some amount of risk, but a relatively small amount.
Increased amount versus right sitting at home.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very
Exactly.
interesting. You have got so much to weigh, Jonathan.
Well, not me, all of
And you talk
us.
about zooming out, right? You started, incident command in fire. Now you've moved out to emergency management. What's the next wider lens?
Yeah, and that's where I'm thinking about judgment under uncertainty, decision making under uncertainty. Is that the decisions that we make as an incident commander are not necessarily completely different, or at least completely divorced from the decisions you might make as somebody who runs a company and you're deciding on whether to do a merger or not. Or even in your personal life, should I move to that next town over there for this job opportunity that's going to pay me slightly more better, but I'm concerned about my quality of life that might decrease in some way? How do you weigh these types of decisions? The truth is that if the skills that you need to be good in one of these, some of those at least are transferable to the other domains. And the types of mistakes that you make in one are the types of mistakes that you might make in another. And that's where I think if we can learn, for example, from how people are making decisions in the military or in medicine, and apply those same lessons and processes and transport them into the fire space, into the emergency management space, I mean, that is, to me, a no-brainer and something that is well overdue.
Yeah, as George Peppard said at the end of Breakfast at Tiffany's, no matter where you go, you just keep running into yourself.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Um, you know, it kind of drives me a little bit crazy in that these insights that are coming from psychology, from behavioral economics, these are insights that have been put in the practice in, for example, the Oakland A's used this in baseball. This is more than 20 years ago now. They wrote a book about it, called it Moneyball, and then
yeah, great book.
made a movie, right?
Yep.
These are insights that they were using then. This has been done in the NBA and in basketball. Houston Rockets, I believe, started off, but now everybody's doing it. Even in hockey, that's Canada.
Yeah, right.
Everybody's doing this stuff, but you know who's not doing it? Wildfire managers or
Yeah.
emergency managers. And our situation is a bit more serious than whether the Canucks will win. And spoiler alert, they probably
Well,
won't.
it's amazing, how much modernization takes place when there's a profit motive.
So how much profit do we need? We're spending enough money on this
Yeah,
fire
right.
problem,
Yep.
but we're doing the same thing again and again and expecting different outcomes, and that's insane.
What a great note to end on, Jonathan. I cannot thank you enough for such an enjoyable hour learning about what you're working on there and your future goals. And we're definitely going to reconnect on this show again, I hope.
Excellent. Thank you.
Awesome. Jonathan Reimer, emergency manager up in the BC area. Thanks so much for joining me. And thank you, my loyal listeners. I don't know how loyal you are, but you're listening, so I'm happy about that. For joining us here on the Fire Break. The Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire. Till I see you next time, take care of yourself, be good, and don't start any fires.